I'm going to be covering a different type of layer in the software-defined world. My name is Sven. I'm working for the company Lannery. Our core competence, our core business is. There you go. Our core business is in the software-defined world is the lowest layer in the equation. So the lowest layer in the equation of the software-defined world is the hardware layer. So the evil necessity in the network, which is costing a certain amount of overhead in order to actually deploy virtual networks. But it's not to underestimate it, because you will need to have some sort of a layer on hardware platforms. We've been doing development for the last 2 years. You can see a couple of the platforms for the software-defined world, starting from the universal CPE all the way to the mobile edge or to the edge computing side. These are all generic platforms intended for network function virtualization throughout the network. Also programmable switching platforms for the SDN layer in the network. And so there's different categories, so from the access aggregation to the core. Our core interest today and what we want to cover in this session is really focusing on around the access with virtual CPE and SD-WAN. And we have one use case what I would like to really highlight is actually, I would like to call it the next generation SD-WAN. Because there is a different way of approaching that whole ecosystem. And we are mainly partnered with multiple companies who are providing SD-WAN solution from a software point of view and trying to really leverage some of the hardware portions and just trying to accommodate the cost by squeezing any dollar out of the hardware in order to deploy it. It might not be the best approach on that. And I'll tell you why in a second. So ultimately, we have different CPE deployment models, right? So we have deployment models which is dedicated for centralized mode, distributed mode, or hybrid mode. Where it's the traditional way how we knew it. We're running hypervisor, we do tunneling. On the centralized mode, ultimately, all the VNF functions are based in the centralized environment. We're running all the VNFs on there. We have a very thin client on the customer premise side. And most of the applications, most of the compute resources are taking place on the edge router. Second level is the distributed mode. Ultimately, we have multiple VNFs running on the universal CPE. So you have multiple function firewall, VPN, routers, and so on at the edge. And then ultimately, you stack it up by service changing. And that requires a certain level of platform to actually ultimately support all these different VNFs in a dynamic environment. And then the third level on this deployment model is in a hybrid mode, where you split the resources between the core cloud infrastructure and the universal CPE devices. Right? So now, talking to some of the SD-WAN providers, and we're talking to a lot of them, we're hearing always the comment that it needs to be a cheap, inexpensive box for this universal CPE. So it's almost like saying if you are a trucking company, you're owning a trucking company, and you have a workload of 5 tons, and you send your driver with a Fiat 500 to pick up that load from one point to another. Obviously, it's not the optimum solution. Similar thing with the rollout for virtual CPEs or universal CPEs or SD-WAN. So the software load can be very heavy and taking all the resources where you have barely any room for deploying VNFs because your overhead is already the hypervisor, the orchestration, and you don't have enough room for running multiple VNFs. So it's a similar concept. So you have to scale the platforms so that you actually have enough headroom to dynamically roll out new services and not taking too many resources away just for the baseline. As a hardware vendor, we've been pounded with questions about pricing, and you know, the price should come down, and we need to find a different way. The reality is the biggest burden today is the memory and the hard drives. So the commodity aspects, prices are going up. So ultimately, we cannot reach in some areas the price target what the end customer is using or using for their calculation for a new business model. So that means maybe rethinking the software approach. How can we put a thinner layer on the orchestration layer in order to reduce the requirements for storage or memory? And memory is the biggest aspect on that. So when I'm hearing customer requirements for 4 cores and 16 gig of RAM, it's kind of, in my point of view, it's a bit of off balance, because if your orchestration layer and everything just to create the pipe already takes away 8 gig of memory, well, you know, you pay the premium for that. If you know how to create it differently, then you will be able to have a lower cost point for rolling out these services. So you can see we have a couple of platforms that we created. We are a premier partner of Intel, that explains why most of our platforms are Intel-based. And what we've been learning is that the performance that we get out of it the most is by combining OVS, Open vSwitch, and DPDK, based on the Intel tool set, but also including and combining LT and Wi-Fi, as well moving up towards 10 gig. So in other words, it's not just any type of box at the end of a customer premise side. It's a specific platform which supports multiple functions, which can provide the baseline for firewall and routing engines on the platform. And as we get along, or moving along, you can see, depending on the amount of VMs and SD-WAN applications, that will drive the specific type of appliances on the customer side. And as Intel is progressing with the processor type, obviously the processor is not becoming the bottleneck on the pricing. As I mentioned, the biggest bottleneck at the moment is the commodity for storage and memory. So again, by choosing the right approach is looking at the cost versus performance. What can I really get out of this SD-WAN appliances? What's the best options on that? Created around the software. So what I'm seeing is that, you know, the software layer is already taking a certain amount of resources, and then the leftover has been considered for the hardware from a cost point of view, which might not be the right approach. So ultimately, you're running out of gas when you roll out for a 3 to 5 year deployment. So the typically deployment model is that we have data plane connectivity, we have a multi-core approach, so 2 core, 4 core, 6 cores, all the way up to 16 cores as a platform. When we have a data plane connectivity, we support MPLS on the platform, and we're using the Wi-Fi and LTE connectivity for manageability into this equation in the deployment model. So if you do the traditional way of deploying it, you obviously stacking up, you do tunneling, you're running multiple applications onto the same hardware platform, and you can provide service chaining. So this service chaining, it takes a lot of resources on the compute side, on the universal CPE. So we've been working with a company called 128 Technology, and they had done a presentation yesterday around the same time slot, explaining how they're actually eliminating some of the overhead in deploying that SD-WAN solutions. And the way they came up with that is using a session-based approach. In other words, you are not always stacking up multiple applications and and creating tunneling, because tunneling eats up all the resources on the virtual CPE and SD-WAN platform. So that means your SD-WAN platform needs to be a much larger one with more memory, compared to when these guys are going into the market. They can have a very thin layer on the customer premise and still provide the services session-based with vector routing. So that means, we have built-in routing, we have security built-in, they are session-oriented and also application-aware. So in other words, if I know it's a firewall, we have a specific path for a firewall application. And also we can then include the security on this as well. So we have a demo on this actually downstairs. Two demos, one of them at the booth A16, the other one on the booth A6. And that's pretty much the architecture on that. So you can see the underlying hardware, which is based on our platform. And it's not limited to LTE and Wi-Fi. It's also supporting traditional ATM infrastructure. So for any legacy customers who would like to deploy SD-WAN, they can utilize the same platform for that as an infrastructure piece of that. And then, so it's basically similar to a bare metal approach on that, but we have all the infrastructure in place where we need to be optimized and to really use the resources as needed rather than running an overhead, which is bringing the cost up in the network. And then we've been going through a customer trial, not a lab trial, a customer trial, which is rolling out about 4,800 stores across the US, using WIF methods, using MPLS, using the LTE as a secondary path, and also using the generic network internet traffic. And it seems to be that this is a more efficient way of dealing with rolling out new services for SD-WAN than we have seen that from other partners and other SD-WAN providers in the market. So it's quite appealing, quite interesting, and can be applicable not only for the SD-WAN, but could also be applicable for the core network infrastructure once you adopt this technology. So the session-based infrastructure is very appealing in this market. So ultimately, we have an ecosystem. You can see there's a couple of partners we've been working on. These are, some of them are using the traditional method. The partnership with 128 Technology has been announced here yesterday. I think it's a very exciting new approach, a new move. And we would like to demonstrate that. What are the possibilities by rolling out new SD-WAN services? So I would like to welcome you downstairs in our booth so you can actually get a real sense on what that means by a session-based SD-WAN deployment. And so if you have any additional questions, I would like to welcome you to open that up. And otherwise, I would like to see you downstairs.